These breaches usually occur due to not a lack of process or smarts or capability. It's often a person or a function of the business sidestepping a process or a piece of technology. And then when you sort of have to analyze, well, why would somebody do that? It boils down to, in my opinion, culture in the organization.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Dane Meah, CEO and co-founder from MyCyso. And today we're discussing Dane's thoughts on the recent Australian breaches. So Dane, thanks for joining. I know there's definitely been quite a few in the last few weeks in particular. So I'm keen to get your thoughts. So maybe start with that. What are your thoughts on all these Australian breaches happening at the moment?
Great. Thanks for having me, KB. It's certainly been very busy, hasn't it? But realistically, we're hearing about a lot more of the breaches of recent times, but we have to bear in mind, breaches occur on a regular basis. And, what you're hearing, what you're seeing about is really only the tip of the iceberg. But certainly not to be downplayed at all, and something we should take heed in and take any learnings from. From my perspective, having analysed some of the publicly known breaches, the likes of Optus, Medibank, Woolworths, etc. One of the interesting observations is that none of those breaches were particularly indefensible or amazingly sophisticated. So I kind of have to ask, why are these breaches occurring, particularly with businesses, in this case, quite large, quite often sophisticated in the defences that they have, with the resources and the smarts to have the best of the best. So you kind of have to go back and ask, well, why are the breaches occurring? Again, looking at the breaches, they're not particularly sophisticated or type of an attack that not be preventable. So I've certainly drawn some conclusions from that, and forming an opinion as more and more information comes about what happened.
Yeah, it's so interesting because all of a sudden it was the Optus, and there was Woolworths, and then Telstra, and then Medibank. It almost feels that it was an organised. All the criminals got together and was okay, we're just going to attack this company, this one, and this one. I've never personally seen it like this in the Australian market.
We're hearing about a lot more breaches, and certainly has put boards and the government on high alert. And it's not to be downplayed, as I said earlier. Having analysed the breaches, that question, quite often there was a lapse of defence at some stage of the attack chain. Be that, in the case of Optus, we've read a lot about the exposed APIs and how that was accessible through an unauthenticated communication. That's really 101 for many organisations, and would have been part of the process that I dare say would have existed for Optus, just to call out as a specific example. So it's not a lack of process necessarily that's caused that breach to occur. My surmisation is that these breaches usually occur due to not a lack of process or smarts or capability. It's often a person or a function of the business sidestepping a process or a piece of technology. And then when you sort of have to analyze, well, why would somebody do that? It boils down to, in my opinion, culture in the organization. Do you prioritize speed of doing business, bringing new features into your application, or sharing information, or using apps that appear to be more effective for the use case? There's many reasons why you might make a shortcut in the security process, but it boils down to culture across your supply chain, end users, your development functions, the culture of really caring and being bought into the need for everybody in the business and the supply chain to take decisions that are going to ensure the protection of data, of those critical assets, the personally identifiable information or credit card numbers, etc. So that has at a high level been my summarization of what's occurred. And of course, culture is not an easy fix. There's been many books written about creating culture, and I'm sure there'll be many more written. In my opinion, it boils down to leadership, values in the business, and also getting buy-in into the program, whether or not it's done from a cybersecurity, driven from cybersecurity, or ideally driven from the business leadership itself. And I think that's probably one of the positive things that we've seen from the recent rise in breaches is that business leaders now, CEOs, and the executive teams are now aware of the cyber risk, and everybody's taking it upon themselves to make sure that it's not their department or it's not a cause of the leadership that's resulting in those breaches occurring.
Yeah, great point. So there's a couple of things that, as you were speaking, what was coming up in my mind, you raised a point about boards are on high alert. Is there anything that you're sort of hearing in your network or perhaps with customers that you work with that people are sort of saying to you that may be a little bit of a theme that you're sort of seeing? Or
Yes, definitely. So through my business, my CISO, speak to a lot of CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, about what are they hearing, how has it impacted their business in the recent times. What I've seen as a consistent trend is a request from boards to have a update on where the business is at from a cybersecurity perspective. And these are important questions boards should be asking of the business and of the CIOs and CISOs. So that's one question. And then, of course, to be able to answer that question comprehensively, it really boils down to how are you measuring your security posture? What ways are you testing the strength of those defenses? How can you provide assurance that your environment is secure from cyber attack? So, and that's often the conversations that we get drawn into to help an organisation, perform assessments of their security posture aligned to, frameworks like ISO 27001, NIST, Essential 8, and so on. So, those are the sort of recommendations that we make. But generally, we're hearing CISOs now kind of not necessarily scramble, but those that maybe don't have a good handle on exactly where they're at. They're looking to perform assessments to identify the critical controls, things like MFA, obviously strong password security, good training for end users, making sure these types of controls are in place, activated on all the systems that could house, critical data.
Yeah, that is interesting because it just seems all of a sudden the board sort of turned to their CISO or head of security or whoever saying like, are we covered? So do you think that now the recent breaches is a catalyst to people sort of checking up on their security?
Yeah, absolutely. But the practicality of answering that question comprehensively is for a lot of businesses, are you ever covered? Can you say for certain that you're going to be able to stop a cyber attack? And reality is no. So really it's about doing the basics well. Over the past decade, I've met hundreds and hundreds of businesses, and in some cases, we've seen businesses that have every well-known vendor, top end tier one vendor known to man in their stack. They've all of the SIEM technologies, all of the edge technologies, all of the data protection technologies. But really good security maturity boils down to more than just having the tech. It boils down to also having process technology and a management structure that's going to manage and support that whole environment continuously. So that's why it boils down to more than just having the tech in place, and the likes of ISO 27001 really critical to seeing where you're at on a holistic basis. And of course, there are other more comprehensive frameworks as well. But that's kind of what we're recommended for businesses, that not just for providing board assurance. The big one of the biggest challenges at the moment is cyber insurance. Cyber insurance market has grown enormously over the past decade. But today, many businesses finding out, to their surprise, that they're uninsurable. And why is that? Well, cyber insurance is also affected by the rise in breaches, because those underwriters are now having to make huge payments out to businesses for breaches. So the cyber insurance providers are standing back and saying, well, we need to see a level of maturity that makes us comfortable that you're not going to have a breach. And again, what does that boil down to? It boils down to having a maturity assessment more or less aligned to a commonly known framework like NIST or ISO 27001. And not to bang the drum too much, but those kind of maturity frameworks is really where we need to all get very comfortable with the vernacular and what are the critical components of those. And then gradually mature our environment aligned to a structured framework like that. So in terms of cyber insurance, though, it is an evolving market. And the way that I'm hearing from cyber insurers that we've spoken to in recent times is businesses are broadly aligned into two key categories. You have on the one side businesses that assess their security posture aligned to a proper framework. They assess and manage their risk, and they can demonstrate an improvement plan that may mean they're not perfect, but they're improving over time. That's the good bucket. Those are the companies that cyber insurers want to insure. But even those, what we're hearing is that even those will see an increase of between 10 and 50% in their insurance premiums. But then the other bucket, so the businesses that are not running a very tight ship in terms of security management, maybe they don't operate to a framework and they don't test their risk for cyber on a regular basis, and they can't demonstrate a improvement plan. What we're hearing is increases of between 3 to 500%, or in one third of cases they won't be insured, is what we're hearing. So that paints a pretty dire picture for organizations who have held the view that, well, we have cyber insurance for that. And a couple of years ago I was starting to hear that more and more, where we might not have the best defenses, but we have cyber insurance. I think those organizations are going to have a bit of a rude awakening when they have neither strong defenses or cyber insurance pretty soon.
Okay, I want to get into the cyber insurance because this is interesting and I really want to hear your thoughts. But before we do that, I just want to go back a step. Now, you're absolutely right. It's hard to answer, like, are we covered? It's not so binary, like yes or no. But what would be sort of the response from a board if a CISO or head of security said, like, actually, no, we're in a really bad place? Would that sort of rattle boards a little bit? Like, because everyone wants to hear, like, yes, we're covered or we're somewhat covered, the best that we can be. But what if someone said, like, no, actually, we're not? Maybe this is your sort of time now to start maybe listening to what me as a security person has to say. Have you ever heard of cases like that in your experience so far?
That would be the majority of cases, surprisingly. And in often case from organizations that are taking cyber seriously. It's actually the organizations that are running cyber well are the ones that are communicating that message. And, it's really for two reasons. One, as I said earlier, we can't be in a position, or we can't believe that we're in a position of complete defense and safety when it comes to cyber. That's the first point. So you would be presenting the wrong impression if you said we're good. But conversely, because of that, you would want to really flag where you are weak and what the risks are. I think the boards are asking questions not because they necessarily want to feel good, but they want to understand where the risks are. So I can think of two examples recently where we've had this conversation, and the feedback to the board was, this is what we've got, but we're by no means secure. And the risks are X, Y, and Z. And what that allows the board to do is make a decision about, do we want to invest? How much do we want to invest to address the gaps that have been presented to us? The organisations that are saying we're good, that I think that's a false sense of security, and wouldn't be in the majority of cases. So I'm hearing more businesses actually want to communicate the risks, and ultimately, the old saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," is probably true in this case as well. But look, we've had a shot across the bow. We're seeing cyber incidents occur at an increasing rate. Let's let's get ahead of the curve before it happens to us. That's the message that should be going to the boards in most cases, I would say.
Yeah, and I absolutely think that that's why they're triple checking their bags and really asking those hard questions, because no one wants to be next. So I really want to get into this cyber insurance. Now, you've probably seen people on the internet for, against. Where do you sit on the cyber insurance side of things? Now, I know it's sort of evolved over the last few years, but I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's like any insurance. It's cyber is a risk, whether it's being a victim of crime and someone breaking into your building and causing damage, or stealing assets. It's exactly the same for cyber. For the past several years, as I just mentioned, there was some concerns that it was being used in lieu of having strong defences. Kind of like having an insurance policy for your car, but then driving recklessly, or leaving the car unlocked in dodgy neighbourhoods. No one would recommend doing that. It's only going to hurt you in the long term. So my view on cyber insurance is, to avoid some catastrophic impact to your business in terms of cost, downtime, ability to manage or handle a response. Cyber insurance is absolutely necessary, but it should be coupled with strong cadence in terms of measuring where you're at in terms of security maturity, because that's what the insurers want to know, but also demonstrating an improvement plan that you can, potentially share with the cyber insurer. That's going to give them the comfort that you're in the good bucket, so to speak, and you're one of the clients they want to insure, and it just will come through with lower insurance premiums. And there's some speaking to some cyber insurers directly recently who are sort of interested in the MessageLabs application for their clients, but speaking to them, the money that you could save on your premiums alone would go a long way towards paying for the security uplift in your environment. So cyber insurance isn't cheap. Any few $1,000s up to big as you like, hundreds of thousands of dollars for an organization and more. That money can easily be offset by the reduced number of breaches or incidents that might occur, but also the money you will save in reduced premiums can be demonstrated through improving your posture so that you become more insurable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes perfect sense. Why do you think people in the industry, though, are pretty against it? Like I said, I've heard both sides. There are definitely practitioners out there that are just really against it.
Yeah, because maybe there's some aversion to people profiting from an emerging problem. I don't know, but yeah, certainly I've not come across that. During the formative years of cyber insurance, perhaps there was a view that how good was the cover? There were some rogue policies out there that wouldn't pay if there was an incident, and really that kind of boils down to ensuring you understand your risk. Start with understanding your risk. Understand what types of incidents would have greatest impact on your business, and then go and ask those questions to your cyber insurer, and then you're not in a situation where you've paid for something and you feel like you haven't received the benefit when you needed it. But going back to your question, why do people dislike cyber insurance? I don't know. I've not heard that one myself.
Yes, well, I guess you're not Nostradamus. You don't have all the answers to these questions. So, okay, I'm really curious now that you made a comment. Are we adequately addressing cyber? Now, I probably know the answer to this, but I'm keen to get your thoughts on how do we adequately address cyber in the market?
Yeah, sure. It's the $1 million question, of course. So I won't claim to have the answer for that one either. But, breaking it down, whether you make widgets or, provide services or whatever, that's first and foremost what you have to do. So cyber has to fit into that. It has to be supported, play a supporting role to you doing business. So whether that's, you have a critical machine in your factory floor, which if it goes down could cause major problems, or whether your business is online, you have to kind of build your defenses around A, what you can afford, but B, where your key risks are. So my kind of suggestion for any IT leader is, first of all, understand where they're at in terms of security. Once you've understand your maturity, understand your risk, identify the improvements that are going to have the greatest impact. That means that you're focusing less of your budget on things that don't really have an impact. So that's my kind of key thing is, how do you identify which of those critical controls, security controls, that are going to have the best impact on mitigating risk in your business. And look, there's several ways that you can do that, but that's how we address the cyber. Not necessarily going to guarantee to stop a breach, but if we focus on basics, we focus on things like the essential 8 first, and even before the essential 8, looking at what are your critical assets, critical devices, and your crown jewels, and building your defenses around those first. I think that's I think that's kind of 101 in cybersecurity. And of course, with any improvement plan, it's making sure you've got the basics right first. If you're just starting out in your security journey, don't kind of go and think, right, we need to implement a SOC or a SIEM. There's going to be a ton of work that you can do, probably within technology that you've already got, like your firewalls, like your Microsoft stack, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be super, super expensive. Often cases, getting the basics done really well, and then incrementally improving based on what's going to have the greatest impact.
So do you think people do basics well? Because again, I mean, I've spoken about this on the show before, like patch management seems easy in theory, but still people struggle with that, whatever the reason is. So I'm curious to know, you mentioned before, like you don't have to go out and think about, we've got to like leverage a SOC or build our own SOC or whatever it is. How do people sort of get to that stage, like going quite like far into the future when they haven't got the basics right? Is it that perhaps they're seeing stuff online, they're influenced by service providers or vendors or whoever it is? Like, how do people sort of think so far ahead when it's like, hey, you've actually got to think about doing the basics as to what you've just sort of said?
Yeah, look, like I've mentioned already, there are some fundamentals of security, which things like enabling multi-factor authentication on all externally accessible systems. These kind of fundamentals. Now, you'd be surprised how frequently we learn that that's not being deployed. So doing the basics, it doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money. Now, clearly, on occasion, there's a reason for that not occurring, or some complexity around certain users or geographic locations that prevent certain controls being deployed. But as a general rule of thumb, getting the basics in place is critical. I mean, to answer your question, so why wouldn't an organization do that? Often case businesses are a complex beast, right? They have, in many cases, bringing together of different environments, different businesses, maybe a merger or an acquisition. These kind of constantly changing, evolving landscapes, and also threat landscape is constantly evolving. So, not to downplay how hard or how easy it is to deploy security controls, which is why focusing on fewer technologies and getting the basics in place is really key.
Yeah, is this more so like curiosity from people, like perhaps jumping the gun, like, let's do all these amazing, like, fully intense things? It's like, okay, well, let's start, like you said, with the basics. Like, it's just more so a curiosity as to why people would be so eager to jump the gun when it's like, well, hey, like you haven't even, you've got to, what's that old saying? You've got to crawl before you can run, so to speak. Like, people are trying to run like pretty quickly. And I'm just curious to know, like, where's that being influenced by?
doing the basics isn't necessarily not the exciting project, right? So, going back and reviewing all of your firewall ports, making sure that things are locked down, making sure there's no, on a consistent basis, doing all of those behaviors around cybersecurity isn't necessarily the exciting part of the job. So, whereas rolling out new tech for, considering most security managers and CISOs are or were technologists, come from the tech side of the business. So that can be a reason why like many people would rather focus on the project side and implementing new shiny things versus the cadence and operational side. That potentially can be where why that gap emerges. But what we see in larger businesses and more mature business is that separation between project and run or operations for that very reason, and then overlaid with a sort of a governance kind of policing and making sure that the systems maintain a standard that has been set by the governance function.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because again, like it's so easy to say, oh, like the basics are easy to do, but it's like, well, in reality, like a lot of people still don't get them right. So it's always a question I like to ask people and hear their thoughts. So now I want to sort of get your view on, we've sort of touched at a very high level about all the breaches that's happened in Australia, but curious to know, really from your perspective, Dane, what can people learn? And I think it's illuminated that boards are going to take it seriously. People are checking their security. They're going out. They're getting cyber insurance. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to perhaps learnings that you're sort of seeing in the market, even from your perspective?
Number one, getting the basics right, and we've covered that already. Whether that be implementing MFA, right, which we've seen be what the cause of one of those breaches, ensuring you don't leave your APIs open to abuse is another. These are relatively basic security controls to have in place. Number two, I would say, is your culture. Do we have a culture of us versus them, i.e. security versus software development or security versus business development? Often case inside a business, that culture is what drives the behavior of people to sidestep security or sidestep a process that's keeping the business safe. So, those conversations need to happen at a leadership level to make sure that right from the top, it's very clear and evident that cyber is a critical component in the business. And I think these are the conversations that are being had right now across boards, across ELTs around the country. Is security, how do we make sure we're not the next business in the headlines? And then the other is a more of a zero trust architecture and approach across the architecture and supply chain would be advantageous. So, re-authenticate and assume nothing is the kind of to kind of simplify the zero trust approach, is to assume nothing, assume that there's no trusted communications and all access is potentially malicious. If you look across the breaches that have occurred, to take that view, whether that be to ask for step-up authentication on every login for critical systems, or having some authentication for your API, those kinds of principles are good things to take away as learnings. The other is to regularly assess your security maturity. So, we're not talking weekly or monthly, but do you know where you're at? Do you know, posturally speaking, what your security maturity would be aligned to a proper framework? Or if you don't, then you're probably winging it. Right? You're watching problems emerge in your business, be that a breach, be that a cyber incident, and you're patching. You're implementing better email security controls, or you're implementing better firewalls. But actually, the better approach is step back, take a holistic view, and build a multi-year improvement roadmap that's not just looking at incidents and putting out the fire that's burning the brightest. So yeah, those are probably 3 or 4 my observations and learnings that I've taken away here. Sure.
So you said people that are winging it. Do you think most people are winging it, or do you think they're sort of like crossing their fingers, closing their eyes and just hoping? Do you think there's a lot of that in there, or is it less of that, or what's your barometer on that?
I think to a degree, many organisations, businesses are doing their best to stay secure. But cyber's like us. Probably 10 years ago, you walk into most businesses, CISO or security manager didn't exist. So, winging it is, we haven't had a choice. I think there's businesses are now, the amount of infrastructure managers that I've met that were transitioned to security managers overnight. Now, they didn't undergo rigorous training to do that. So, winging it sounds harsh, but it's true. I think it's a necessity to stand up and do the best that we can under the circumstances. But I think that what's changing is that doing our best now requires using the tools at our disposal, and a greater amount of rigor is one of those tools, and through maturity frameworks like I've said many times, ISO and others, and that's no longer becoming an edge case kind of you've taken it really seriously then with using a framework. Now it's become the mainstay, and if you look at the government's response to the recent breaches, we've seen an immediate response, which was to increase the penalties relating to serious or repeated breaches, rising from a fairly modest 2.2 million. Wouldn't be nice if you were receiving that penalty, but equally probably is a rounding error for some businesses, to 50 million. Does it go far enough? Well, it certainly would sting for most, if not all, businesses to receive that penalty. But compared to penalties under other legislation like GDPR, where it's significantly higher, this is still relatively low. But yeah, certainly a step in the right direction as well.
Yes, you're right. I definitely think there'll be a few penalties issued this year in Australia. So in addition to the government stuff that you sort of just touched on in terms of the increase of the penalties, is there anything else that you sort of expect that we can see moving forward as like for Australian businesses? Like, is there anything like you can sort of hypothesize that you think will happen as we sort of traverse into this post all these breaches that have happened that you sort of expect that should happen, even like whether it's now or even in 2023, for example?
We saw in the press recently, Coles have doubled their cybersecurity budget. So any IT leader should be preparing a board briefing, sending that to the board to really say, this is the state of the current cyber landscape in Australia. To respond to that, we should be looking to double down and improve our security posture to make sure, we're not exposed or one of the next unfortunate victims of cybercrime. So there's going to be an increase in expenditure and focus in cyber. That's going to have a flow-on impact to, the skills shortage as more and more businesses look to hire cybersecurity personnel. But then also, an opportunity as well towards, MSPs and consulting firms to build out more security capability to kind of augment, whatever other services, whether that be managed IT or otherwise. That's the opportunity that exists. So, if any of your listeners are in that space and they're not in security, or they're not playing, they're not able to offer a comprehensive engagement to their clients, that's a huge opportunity that they're probably missing out on at the moment. And I've seen that directly myself, where we've been asked to support a business that has a managed service provider in place. The MSP is really not doesn't have the skill set to kind of comprehensively address cyber. So, if you're a managed service provider, go and skill up, and make sure that you have, security in your stack, comprehensive way. The old days of offering, your security package being firewall, endpoint protection, and perhaps email security and a bit of awareness training, that's obviously, those days are behind us. And terms like frameworks that I've mentioned, risk management, kind of are going to become more mainstream and less exclusively the 5% or so that have regulatory requirements to apply to a certain standard or framework.
Yeah, great points. Great tangible points as well for people to take away. In terms of any final thoughts or closing comments, is there anything quickly, Dane, you'd like to leave our audience with today?
This rising breach and the kind of threat vector has obviously put a lot of business on edge. I've created a few assets that I'll include the links in the comments of this blog. A board briefing, which really a summary of all of the breaches we've seen over the past couple of months. Some of the observations. So that I'll happy to share that with your audience. And outside of that, always happy to help with anybody that needs to assess their security posture. Check out mysizer.co and would be happy to take you across how that may be able to help you.
Awesome. Wonderful. No, I appreciate your thoughts and your insights. And I guess some of the questions I asked, they're not an easy answer. So I appreciate you taking the time today for coming on the show.
No, you're more than welcome. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MercSec, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.